Good evening. We thank you all so much for coming out tonight. We are about to begin the second of two presentations this evening. This morning we had a gathering, a legislative breakfast with Senator Schultz, Representative Mark Line, and Dr. Bambi Stotts. This evening, Representative Mark Line is not able to be with us, but we do have Senator Schultz with us and Dr. Stotts, who will be presenting. This morning, she presented a very brief overview of the information regarding school voucher expansion. And this evening, she has much more factual information. Our intent is to provide factual information for you. This morning, we had arranged for a situation where between Representative Mark Line and Senator Schultz that there was a balance present and people were able to ask questions of all three of the individuals. Although we don't have all three with us tonight, there will be questions at the end of the evening, so if you want to write down questions, please feel free, and we'll entertain those after the presentation. I also want to publicly thank the Dodgeville Chamber of Commerce, who, although its mission is not to take sides on any particular issue, its mission is to create forums or create opportunities for community people to learn about the issues at hand. And that was their intent. I thought they did a marvelous job this morning of bringing people together with various viewpoints to hear information about school vouchers, and it was very informative. So tonight we're going to do the same thing. I'm going to introduce you to Dr. Bambi Stotts, who is a professor emeritus at the University of Wisconsin-Whitewater. She teaches in, I believe it's public finance and school management, and also has quite a dedicated history in terms of service to public education. So at this point, I'm going to ask Dr. Stotts to come forward and she can fill you in on the details.
Thank you, Diane. It's a pleasure to be here this evening, and I really appreciate your attendance. This is the first nice evening we've had, and whoa, I don't know if we can even count the days. So thank you so much for sharing that with us and this important issue. Just a little bit more about my background, so you know sort of why I'm up here and who I am, other than that I have a weird name. I've been in school finance in Wisconsin in that field for 40 years as of this year. And I began it as a business manager in a local school district and served in that capacity in 4 different school districts. They all happen to have been in Dane County. From there, I went to the Department of Public Instruction, and I served as Assistant State Superintendent for School Finance under Bert Grover and John Benson, and then was invited to go down to Whitewater, where I had received my degree and certification in school business management, and I went down there and took over that program. So I had 15 years of teaching in that program and training other people to become finance directors in our public schools throughout Wisconsin. Along with that, I then, since I was no longer working for a particular school district or the state of Wisconsin as an administrator any longer, I took the opportunity to run for our local school board. So I spent 12 years on the school board in the school district of Waunakee, just north of Madison. So my experience is really kind of a third, and a third in my career in terms of being a local administrator, a state administrator of our whole school finance system, and then higher education training people to do both of those. So I have had a tremendous set of opportunities within the public sector in Wisconsin and try to take every opportunity I can to give back. And this is my favorite way of doing that, is helping people throughout the state to learn more about how our system works. So my goal tonight is to really focus on your topic, or the topic of sort of this morning and this evening, which is some of the private options that are in this biennial budget for next year and the year after. Some of these programs already exist and are slated for expansion under the proposed budget, and there are some new ones. And it's really important in formulating each one of our opinions about what we think of these programs to have some foundation of what they really represent. And not only the programs and the content of the programs and how they serve students in Wisconsin, but you need to know that they affect you. They affect each and every taxpayer, almost every taxpayer in Wisconsin, and I'm going to share with you the fact that some taxpayers don't contribute to some of these. You do. So I want you to know that before you leave tonight. So let me move forward with this presentation, and then, as Diane indicated, we'll have time for questions and answers, and we have Senator Schultz here and some other local representatives who I think will be making some comments or answering questions as well. We can't talk about school finance in Wisconsin without acknowledging that K-12 education is a state responsibility. That is first determined by our federal constitution, which says that anything that's not prescribed for the federal government does in fact become the responsibility of the states. That's in Article 10 of the U.S. Constitution. So by virtue of that, each state has responsibility for K-12 education. We further reinforce that in our state constitution in Article 10, Section 3, which says that the legislature shall provide, it acknowledges the function being the state, and that the legislature shall provide for the establishment of district schools as nearly uniform as practicable. You think about what you have been learning about your own district and surrounding districts and what you might know about some districts throughout the state, even other public school districts, and think about whether you think they're as uniform as they could be. And that's, I hope to, through this evening, raise some questions for you that not give you as many answers other than the facts and how some things work, but you formulate your own conclusions. Here's one of the other things that I think it's important to point out, is that in our state constitution it also calls for those public schools to be free from sectarian education. So there is to be no religious instruction in our public schools. And then our chapters in our state statutes go on to say that with the organization of public schools, they should then be governed by local school boards. So we have board members here tonight, of course, and you as citizens have been no doubt active in electing board members. So you're doing that because they have some authority for the oversight of the programs and the fiscal impact of your local districts in your community. And that's been a very strong legal foundation and tradition in Wisconsin, is to provide for local control. Whoops, pardon me, I'll try to get this direction correct. Going into then a little bit further, Wisconsin statutes, the statutes also indicate that just because we have individual local school districts does not mean that the citizens in each of those school districts should have to bear the 100% of the burden for running those schools, particularly we're thinking of the fiscal aspect, right? And so our statutes say that because education, K-12, public education, is a state function, that then there should be some relief from the general property tax. And for that reason, we have several aid programs. The biggest one is called our General Aid Program. And that is in law and has been actually since the inception of our state in 1848 with our Common School Fund, which was the original state aid to schools and still exists. But we have General Aid now, which is intended to provide property tax relief. And at the same time, the statutes acknowledge that there should be equal educational opportunities, reasonable equality of opportunities across our school districts, and that, of course, school districts need to subscribe to the state standards. So there's oversight by the state, because remember, it's a state responsibility. But that responsibility is then within the framework of the standards and some other legal provisions about licensing and things like that, is delegated to local school boards. It is then, again, acknowledged here that it's the purpose of the state aid formula to provide property tax relief, to cause the state to assume a greater portion of costs for public education. What happens when there is state aid coming to a community, to a school district, there's property tax relief. Let me depart from the slide briefly to ask you how many of you have heard of the term revenue limits or revenue caps. Okay, in our state law, we have those revenue caps, and I think just about everybody here raised their hand, so I'm obviously not going to go into that in any great depth. But what those caps do is they define each year the amount of revenue, the major forms of revenue, that a district is able to raise. So that cap is defined. It's a dollar amount for Dodgeville and each and every school district. To the extent that the state provides general aid to your community, your actual property tax dollar amount goes down, right? The more state aid that goes in, because that revenue limit is fixed. So we subtract from that the amount of state aid, and the difference is your property taxes, okay? So that means that the more state aid that comes in to your community, the lower your property tax. What does that mean if there's less state aid? What happens to property taxes? They go up. Okay, that's very important to our looking at some of the trends that we're going to this evening. So if we take away state support, it raises property taxes. Providing funds to private schools also raises property taxes, and I'm going to show you how that occurs. We're going to do that within the context of these programs because these are the ones that are referenced in the current biennial budget proposal. So we have the Milwaukee Parental Choice Program, which became law in 1989 and was implemented in 1990. Did I say 1889? I hope I didn't. 1989. And then more recently, in the last biennium, the Racine community was added to that. So it is now the Milwaukee and Racine Parental Choice Program, often referred to as vouchers. So we're going to talk about that program. And we're going to talk about the proposed expansion for that program to other communities in Wisconsin. Then we have independent charters, and we'll talk about those. We've had charter schools in Wisconsin for a good decade and a half. The original charters, and many of them still exist and some new ones are being created, were really developed by school boards in communities with the cooperation of their professional educators and parents and others in the community who developed charter schools around particular programs. A very common situation is charter schools for children at risk to provide different kinds of learning environments and sometimes even different content area. So those charter schools have existed. This is different, and I'll explain to you how it's different. And then we have special education vouchers. So those are the areas that I'll go over this evening and talking a little bit about the programs and sharing with you what the financial impact is of those programs. Whoops, I did it again, went the wrong way. So now we're on vouchers. They presently exist in Milwaukee and Racine communities. Again, going back to 1990 when they were first implemented, they were intended and only implemented in Milwaukee and intended to provide an alternative for children who were living in low-income circumstances within the Milwaukee Public Schools. So what the program did was it provided public money that went to private schools and gave those students and their parents the option to attend those private schools. At its inception, and for many, many years, low income was defined as 175% of the federal poverty level. Do you see a higher percentage up there now on the slide? We see 300% up there, don't we? That's being redefined so that poverty is now middle class in Milwaukee. And you can see those thresholds. A family of two, which would be a parent and one school-age child, if the income in that household is $45,000, they qualify to go into this program. And look down to the family of four, and really the adjustment I show over to the edge of the slide to $77,000 is for a family of a father and a mother intact in the home with two children. That family, their income, as long as it's below $77,000, they are determined to be low income for purposes of the Milwaukee and the Racine programs presently. Do you think in this part of the state those income levels represent low income? Okay, so I think it could be said that there are other than low income families now taking advantage of the opportunity to send their children to private schools in Milwaukee and Racine, many of which are parochial schools. Now let me pause for a moment and say we have had strong private schools and private parochial schools in Wisconsin since we became a state. And they have a role, and parents have every right to select schools around whether it's a parochial ideology or another kind of learning environment. However, traditionally before this program came into being and in the rest of the state, when parents make those choices, they typically pay tuition or get grants or by whatever means they attend those private schools. What we're talking about with the voucher program is that the tuition is paid for out of public funds, as opposed to having parents pay that tuition. So there's now a proposal to expand the voucher program and to expand it to other communities. Now there's a definition so that every other community in the state doesn't initially qualify. So the districts have to be 4,000 pupils or more, and they have to have 2 or more low-performing schools. Now there is a lot of controversy around the definition of low-performing schools, and I'm not going to pretend to be an expert at that, but I'm listening through the hearings and other press conferences and so forth to the people who are, and there was a group that came together and helped to identify thresholds and cooperated, educators and others cooperated in the development of this report card system, but they did that with the common understanding, or at least as I'm told, the majority understanding, that the report card would not be used yet to try to define high or particularly low performing schools because it's not been perfected and the data aren't out there over time. And so at any rate, that's highly controversial. But with that definition, you can see the urban districts that at this point would be eligible as communities for the choice expansion. In these situations, the proposed budget, or what would be the new law, does say that there should be an emphasis on low income, and in this instance that's defined through the free and reduced lunch price thresholds. I apologize. I am a numbers person. I won't apologize for that. I am a numbers person. You don't like me to move around, do you? Should I? Okay, okay, I have a hard time standing still. So I am a numbers person. What's not so important here is that you remember $106 or $150 million, but look at the relationships between the dollars. So at the top of this slide, we have the Milwaukee Parental Choice Program. Then we'll look at Racine, and then we'll look at the proposed expansion and the costs. So this year in 2012-13, the Milwaukee Parental Choice Program has a cost of about $151 million. Now the reason I'm breaking that out is I want you to see that state GPR is funding a portion of that, or about $93 million for this year, and when the state general purpose revenue, when GPR is used to fund something, the source of GPR is us, right? It's our income and sales taxes. So everybody pays that in to Madison, and that's redistributed in many different ways, obviously through the state budget. But in this regard, $93 million is being paid to these private schools in Milwaukee and Racine that came out of our pocketbooks. So we are helping to pay for those programs. Now the MPS state aid reduction of about $58 million comes out of the taxpayers' pockets in Milwaukee. So they get hit on both levels. But I wanted to define what your obligation is, or what you are contributing versus Milwaukee, because there is a split there. Now, under the state budget, look at how the projected growth of the program and increased allowed expenditures in the private school programs and increased children will increase that cost. And what now is $93 million for the taxpayers across the state would be $107 million. Under the Racine program, which has just gotten off the ground in the last 2 years, the total cost is $3.2 million. Our collective contribution is $1.9 million. And the Racine taxpayers are also kicking in because they're losing state aid. Their state aid that they otherwise would have gotten is contributed to these private schools. So that, in essence, is a tax increase for them, because under the revenue cap, remember, if their state aid goes down, their tax levy goes up. Now, I will qualify this, that they do not have to levy that difference. But I'm going to show you some other information about the trends that have been happening in the state's allowed increase or lack thereof in spending and revenue generation for schools. So it's easy to say, well, they wouldn't have to tax for it, but remember, the consequences of not taxing for it would be to reduce expenditures at a time when their expenditure allowance from year to year is already not keeping pace with what their cost increases are. So what it would mean is, in order to help pay for the programs in Milwaukee and Racine, the children in their schools, or in our case, the upper line, our schools, would have reduced services in order to do that. So it's one way or the other. Now the expansion, which would begin next year in those urban districts that I highlighted, their costs are projected to be about what Racine's are now, and then similar to what Racine's would be in the second year of biennium by that time. Participation and payments. This year, Milwaukee Parental Choice Schools receives $6,442 per pupil. That is originally based upon the Milwaukee level of state aid per pupil. Milwaukee, while it has its challenges and it has obviously an immense level of diversity in the student population and their needs, it is a modest to poor community in serving its students. So it gets a high level of aid. So what happens is this level of aid is what goes roughly to the private schools. So that level of aid is more than 80% of the public school districts receive in state aid. And let me just repeat that a little bit differently. This $6,442 that's per pupil that's going to these private schools in Milwaukee currently is more state support than 80% of the public schools are getting for their children in general aids. And then this $6,442 is estimated by the Legislative Fiscal Bureau to go to a little over $7,000 for K-8 and $7,856 for high school by the second year of the biennium. I did it again, didn't I? Okay, let's jump to independent charters. Again, I think I already offered you the definition of charters, public charters that are under the purview of our school boards in each and every community. So that's what has existed. This is different. This is in addition to that. So right now, the authorizing agencies for these kinds of independent charters are outside the public school district, but they are the ones enumerated here in Milwaukee and Racine. So at this time, they are public entities, but they are not public K-12 schools or school districts. And so when one of these entities begins an independent charter school, when we say independent, it is independent of the local school board and largely independent of state oversight to the degree the public schools are. So the Milwaukee and Racine charters receive a payment from the state, and that payment for this year is estimated to be $7,775 per pupil, with 7,600 pupils participating. So the cost for this year is estimated at, you can see a sliver under $60 million. So that's Milwaukee and Racine, right? It's the only place it can exist right now. Do you think it affects you? Yes, it does. You're helping to pay for this. And let me show you. Oh, I am so sorry. I'll get this. What happened was, in order to fund this program, it was determined through state law that the state aid would be reduced in almost every other Wisconsin school district, and those dollars sent to Milwaukee and Racine to these independent charter schools. So in order to make those programs whole, the amount of state aid that was reduced across the board was 1.39. I rounded it to 1.4% here. So that's 1.4%. Average across school districts is $140,000 off of their aid. Same situation exists that I described in MPS, or Milwaukee Public Schools, for the vouchers. The school districts are allowed to tax the difference because, remember, we've got the revenue cap. If the state aid is less than it otherwise would have been by an average of $140,000, the school district is likely to tax for that difference because that makes the revenue cap whole and, quite frankly, the better chance of maintaining programs or more programs from one year to the next. And the hit here in Dodgeville for this year, about $91,000. So this means that your property tax bills here in Dodgeville collectively went up by about $91,000, and those dollars were sent to these independent charters in Racine and Milwaukee. I will get this, I think. Now, I wanted to point out something besides your immediate impact, because you people that know about revenue limits and you've been paying attention to your local elections and to local policies and state policies, you need to know that all taxpayers in Wisconsin are not treated identically under this. Because remember that 1.4% reduction in state aid, you have to get the state aid first. Now, if I were allowed the luxury of describing for you exactly how our general aid formula works, you'd be sitting on these, not the most comfortable chairs for an additional hour or more. So I'm not going to go into exactly how the intricacies of the formula work. But let me just tell you this. The less property value that a school district has, the more state aid it has. Because the state jumps in and it helps the property taxpayers so that they're not overburdened in order to provide that program that adheres to the standards and the local wills of the people, right? So poorer communities, moderate to poorer communities in the state of Wisconsin get more state aid. So 1.4% of their state aid is a bigger dollar amount, right? Now the reverse is also true. Very wealthy communities do not receive this general aid because their property tax value is so great that they're ineligible. That means that, and you can see on this chart, there are some, these are the total dollar amounts that 1.4% represents for just a collection of other districts that I looked up. But look at over here at these zeros. Gibraltar, by the way, is Door County. Beautiful, beautiful area of our state. Represents what we highly value in this state, water. You can't get a whole lot more water than a peninsula, but there's Washington Island as well. So here's Gibraltar, our actual wealthiest K-12 school district in the state, Green Lake among the wealthiest, and Three Lakes. So in those resort areas, because the district is not eligible for general aid, the taxpayers in those communities do not share in the responsibility for paying for those independent charters. So I'm not an attorney, but if I were, one of the things I would be looking at is the uniformity clause in our state constitution, which says taxpayers must be treated uniformly or the same across the state. And we had a very substantial case that went to our state Supreme Court in 1976 called Voucher versus Smith. And the conclusion of our Supreme Court in looking at that case was that it is unconstitutional in Wisconsin to levy a local tax to be spent elsewhere. I would suggest that, again, some clever attorneys look at this situation because we are levying a local property tax in most of the communities across Wisconsin in order to spend it in this case for the independent charters in a couple of communities, which are likely or may be expanded if this goes through on the budget. So one other characteristic I really need to point out about these communities is when we have resort areas, there are a lot of people who have beautiful homes on water that don't live there. So what's happening is that the people, many of the people in these communities that are not sharing in that same cost for independent charters in this example are people who have second homes in those communities. And by the way, Andy Rashofsky has done a study looking at percentages of people in Wisconsin with second homes and non-Wisconsinites with second homes in Wisconsin. So do you know that we're providing additional property tax relief or lack of commitment by a lot of non-Wisconsinites with property in the state are not helping to contribute to the independent charters in this case. We have some other places in school finance where that happens as well, but I won't belabor those tonight. Here's 1976, the lawsuit that I talked about, Voucher versus Smith. And so I have already gone through that, and I think that that's taking care of it. Now, another provision related to the charters is the development of a state authorizing board. This is not public school board members. This is not an elected board by the electorate. This would be a state board that would review proposals for independent charters, not necessarily by public entities as the current ones are, and they would determine which ones to approve. Even if local school boards said, we don't think that's appropriate in our community, this board at the state level could say it's happening. So our strong and long tradition of local control, local involvement, local interest, vested interest, is being really thwarted by this kind of an independent board. In 2000, we had another Supreme Court case, and it was called Vincent versus Voigt. And in this instance, our Supreme Court said that largely our school finance system is constitutional, does treat children and taxpayers fairly in the way that it distributes what state funds are available. That's before some of these programs I just talked about. But at the same time, it said the legislature must provide for funding according to student need. And it very specifically identified 3 populations of students. And it said that there must be provisions for state support for students who are disabled, students who are economically disadvantaged, and students with limited English language skills. So in those 3 areas. So the effect was to say, revise our school finance system in order to make sure that those populations are funded adequately. So we have in Wisconsin a set of aids. I said general aids before, now I'm using a categorical aid, that term. This is a collection of state support dollars that go out to largely public schools in Wisconsin at this time. And those programs are designed around specific needs of students. So it's in this cluster of programs where we would find state funding related to these 3 populations. So the red figures here are not meant to say that those are negative. I just use those to highlight the fact that they went down from the year before. So please, they're positive figures, but I wanted to make that a little bit more visual. So you can see that the state commitment, just in recent years, as recently as 08-09, the state commitment to these populations of students has been extremely inconsistent. And I must say it's at a time when the student numbers in all 3 of these areas have been growing. So the numbers have been growing, the costs related to serving students with these 3 areas of needs have grown, and yet the state support has not coincided. These are some of those categorical aids that specifically aim at these populations. And I'm simply pointing out here that what they are this year in those categories, what they're proposed in the budget, and then what the change is. So I'm simply pointing out that under the proposed budget, there is not at this point any renewed commitment to these populations. This table is showing you, again, some of these major categorical aids, and what happens is, unlike some of these programs that steer public dollars to private entities, those are what we call sum sufficient. Whatever those entities are eligible for, they get 100% of it, and then it comes off the rest of our aid and ultimately property taxes, as I've described. In this case, what happens is the state has underfunded the eligibility that districts have for these programs. And so they do what we call prorate. They prorate the amount of aid that's returned to the community. As I said, I go back 40 years, and when I started in this business, special education aid was really provided at 70% of the cost was refunded to the school district by the state. You can see in 2000, 2001, that was at 36%, but please look at where it is today, 26%. So in public schools today, the programs for our special needs students are really only funded at 26% of the eligible costs in those programs. Then we have for English language learners, started at 18% about reimbursement rate, and again, because the funds are insufficient to meet the needs, that's really 9.5% roughly. And sparsity aid is for some of our rural areas around the state, and it is tied to low income, which is why I've included it here, and I simply point out the vacillation in the reimbursement rate there. So that brings me to another proposal in the state budget, which is now a voucher system for children with special needs. So this is a proposal to now provide public funds to programs in private schools that take special needs pupils. I want to just throw in here, again, I'm not pretending to be an attorney, but in my 40 years experience administering school programs and the financial aspect of it, I have always been told that no matter what, a public school cannot relieve itself of the responsibility for residents with special needs. So here we have a program that's proposed to serve students with special needs in private schools. Well, I think that means that the students that would be selected by private schools, because I didn't mention it before, but in any of the private options that are out there now in receiving public funds or not, those options can accept whatever students they want and they don't want. So they do not have to take students with special needs. If they wanted to join into this program, they would have to take students with special needs. And I think because of the costs associated with it and ability to serve them, they're likely to take the most mild, the children with the most mild, and therefore the lower cost needs and the special needs spectrum. What that means is it leaves the public schools with all the other children. And I don't think anybody I've ever known in public education would say we should not serve those students. But the fact of the matter is, if we're drained of some of the state support and drained of the children who are actually easier to serve in that category, that may come back to us because, as I said, it's my belief that if somebody else does not meet the needs of a child with special education, that the federal laws say the public school district needs to. So I'm not sure that we can really divorce ourselves from that in any case. So this kind of a program provides a scholarship that would follow the child, and that child or parent could choose another public school. They could choose perhaps even in their same district, kind of dictate where they think their child should go. A neighboring public school among private options or charter schools, and that the dollars, because it's dubbed as a scholarship, follows the child to wherever that service provider is. The calculation is based upon average property tax levy, and it gets into special ed aid, so there's a dollar amount that flows with that child to whoever is providing that service. It's estimated by the Fiscal Bureau that in the first year of the biennium that would be just under $7 million in cost, and by the second year of the biennium it would be double that, pretty much I think based upon participation. Here is a graph that the Department of Public Instruction put together to show, I think rather vividly, what happens with spending and revenues in special education. In this example, if this program costs $21 million to provide, what happens is the public school gets no new special education aid. Remember, I told you that's flat funded. In fact, to the extent that costs go up, I guarantee you they do, to serve the same population, and particularly our special education population, those costs go up, but the aid didn't go up. That means that that's on the local property taxes, and sometimes even comes out of other educational programs because these programs are mandated, as they should be, but the funding is a pretty big issue here. So special education vouchers would then receive $21 million in this example that would be distributed to those other, to wherever the child and the parents went, and at the same time, the local costs are there. So, or the reduction in aid, because that's what's going to happen. The aid is going to be taken away from the public schools. Now, the proposed budget also calls for freezing revenue for public schools. So, at the same time that these other private ventures are being expanded or being added to the whole menu of private options, at the same time, the state is tying the hands of public schools by saying your revenue cap is going, it usually has a per pupil increment. Sometimes, you know, it's $150 a child, sometimes it's $200. It was supposed to be tied to the CPI, the rate of inflation. But at any rate, the present budget calls for not increasing that. Here is a graph that again comes from the Department of Public Instruction showing that revenue limit and the ability to raise revenues, or that per child increment, is showing it from the beginning of revenue limits. And that was 1993-94. So, yes, there have been some increases in the increment. There have been some decreases. A couple of years ago, huge decrease. And now we, this year, recovered a portion of that, but under the new budget would go back down in terms of the revenue limit ability, or ability to raise revenues in local districts. So I think it's really important, I think, to look at the whole picture, what is happening with state support for the public sector of K-12 education. At the same time, there are proposals to expand the private ones. Per pupil revenues, if we look at it by type of service program, public schools under this biennial budget, the per pupil revenues are designed to increase 0. Independent charters to go up $156 per pupil, and voucher schools over $1,400 per pupil. Here's another DPI graph which shows each of those entities and the revenue per pupil. So on the top in the red we have the public school allowable revenues. In the green we have independent charters, and then we have vouchers, the choice schools. This chart, I think, is, again, I think this is a very helpful way to compare both the spending and the state aid, as we can track it between the public school programs and the other two that we've been talking about this evening. So, first of all, let's look at the number of children affected by these public policy issues. In our public K-12 schools throughout the state, we have about 864,000 students. For that portion of our students, which is the vast majority, because in independent charters, 10,500, and voucher schools, 30,000. A growing number in both cases, but much less than the 864,000 who are housed in public schools throughout Wisconsin. The per pupil increase that is proposed for those 864,000 pupils is 0. And what I told you on the previous slide for independent charters, 156. And you can see that the figures are different for K-8 versus high school in the voucher schools. So that's the picture on the spending side, or the ability to raise revenue in order to spend. And then when we look at it on the state aid side, when DPI figured this $39 million by taking the total new aid to come, proposed to come to K-12 public schools, and it netted out the aid reductions due to the new programs where I showed you that aid would be reduced in order to fund those private programs. So that really constitutes a net of $39 million in new aid to help support programs for 864,000 pupils in our state. That's a per pupil increase of $45. In the case of the independent charters, serving 10,500 and expected to go up somewhat, $156 per pupil, the amount of state resources, $23 million. Per pupil, $21.90. And voucher schools, $73 million. So what this does for me, and you draw your own conclusions, but I am going to share with you mine. Because I think in numbers, which is how I think a lot, in numbers, what it does is it translates the public policy that's being discussed in Madison. It translates that into who gains how much and what the emphasis is. And I have a hard time looking at these numbers and thinking anything other than that the proposed set of programs for new and expanded private options is the priority, as opposed to maintaining programs for our public school children, the vast majority of our youngsters throughout the entire state. Well, I'm not going to read through these. I'm going to basically just conclude by saying that our state first has a constitutional and legal responsibility to provide the framework and fiscal support for public school children, public school districts, and therefore children and taxpayers throughout Wisconsin. If we felt that that was, let me put it in my own words, I don't want to put words in your mouth. If that were happening, and we had 424 public school districts throughout the state that were able to maintain programs for children each year because of their allowed spending increase and the states coming in and assisting districts based upon their need, based upon their property tax base, if that were happening, and if I were convinced that in every Wisconsin community that our public schools were able to provide a continuum, because that's what I believe public education is about. I believe it's about a continuum. That if a school board determines that this is the set of programs and experiences that our children should have from perhaps age 4 up through 20 or 21, that those opportunities ought to be there for the next class to get to 4 years old or 5 years old, or hit high school, or get into high school and start a foreign language and be able to take that for the duration of high school. That's a continuum. That's an expectation that we can identify what's good for our children in each community, obviously meeting the standards in the process, but provide that continuum so that those experiences don't vacillate. And I don't believe we're able to do that after 20 years with the state-imposed revenue limits and the harsh treatment in both the revenue limits and state aid that public schools have received recently. So if we're not doing that, I ask the question, I'll try not to answer it, you can probably guess how I would, but that's not the important thing. What I'd like you to do is ask the question, are we doing an adequate job of supporting our public K-12 system throughout the state? And at the same time, can we entertain supporting a second system, a private system, and expanding what's there? So I'm going to leave you with that question. I have a few more points on these slides, and you're welcome to look through those. I guess the last one that I would simply say is that, you know, maybe these other private options are worth considering. But if they are, let's do that in a venue where we can see the debate and where we know that that debate is happening not only locally but in Madison, and that thoughtful conclusions are drawn, And I think that means outside the budget process. So debate never hurts. Debate enlightens and it brings out the various perspectives, but that doesn't happen when we have major public policy issues occurring within a state budget. So I will leave you with that and we can turn to that. I'll be happy to take questions at the time, but I think you have other people who might want to make comments.
Does any school board member here in this audience care to share what you are struggling with in your own districts? Would you come forward?
I'm Maureen May Grimm from the Mineral Point School Board. I've been on the school board 6 years. We've struggled with cuts from day one. It's getting worse and worse. There's, you know, in the beginning, there might have been some fat to cut, but we're down to the bone. And a friend of mine put it really well a couple years ago. He said, basically, your decision is whether you need your left hand or your right hand more. We just had a personnel meeting earlier this week, and with all of the new requirements with the core curriculum and the state tests coming through and all of these pressures, we need extra assistance with people to help kids that are struggling with reading to make sure that by the time they get into the 6th grade, they know how to read so they're not going to fall through the cracks. So that when kids are in high school, they don't start falling behind in math because we've had to escalate our math program. There's just nothing left to cut. We recently had some parents come with a proposal for a charter school for our district. And people are wanting some more different ways of educating children with that they feel would be better educated another way. I don't know how we're supposed to pay for this stuff. And I get really tired of saying no. Last year we had our middle school band director left the district. We did not fill that position. We now have kids in band lessons, up to 7 kids with different instruments in the same class. I'm not talking about band practice, I'm talking about lessons. So you've got a 9th grader and a 12th grader, trombone and trumpet or clarinet, all in the same lesson for 20 minutes. And they have to pull them from a class quite often to get that lesson. So while we're trying to have this ramped up rigor, we have to pull them to be able to schedule this in the day. This year we added a weekly CRT program, which I believe Dodgeville already does. We added a half a day every week because we have to have that so our teachers can collaborate together to meet all of these new requirements. Some of them are good. Some of them are to add rigor. But you have to have time to do that. And so it really, really angers me to my core when I see what is happening to our public schools to benefit a few. In Milwaukee, we know they have problems. But there were just recently 2 Milwaukee schools that were in some of the top schools in the state. How about we look at what they're doing right and we use that in the other schools in Milwaukee instead of trying to reinvent it and making sure that the rest of them fail is what I feel is going on. It's trying to make public schools fail.
Thank you, Maureen. We really appreciate that. Is there a board member from another district that would like to come forward? Mark, would you like to come forward? Mark is the president of the Dodgeville School Board.
Thanks, Diane. As Diane mentioned, I'm the president of the Dodgeville School Board. I just elected for my 4th term. I'll be starting in May. I think Dodgeville may be one of the unique districts in this part of the state. We've been very fortunate in some ways. About 7 or 8 years ago, we were facing very significant financial straits, cutting programs, a negative fund equity position. It was a pretty tough time to join the board. But we went to our voters and we were successful in passing an operating referendum, perpetual operating referendum at that point in time, that even though we still had some cuts to make and some belt tightening to do, we were able to maintain the buildings, replenish our technology, our textbooks, and add some programs that were sorely needed in the district. I think the other thing that we're very fortunate about, at least until recently, is our enrollment has been growing year after year on average since 2000, and we're one of the only districts in this part of the state. Barneveld is basically flat over that time, that has shown some growth, at least until the last couple of years where our enrollment dropped. So both of those things have helped us from a district standpoint. And then the third thing I think that has helped us is clear and vocal input from the community on both sides of the equation, supporting what we do and sometimes not supporting what we do. But the boards I've had the pleasure to work with have always taken input from the community seriously in trying to set policy and direction and programs to help our children succeed. Those things, I think, based on what Bambi talked about this evening and some of the challenges that we faced in the last couple of years, I'm hopeful that our good fortune doesn't run out, that we are able to provide a quality education for the children of our district. But these are things that worry myself, the administration, the staff, and I know my fellow board members as well. So I think it's helpful to understand. Everybody can make up their mind, just like when I speak to the members of the district, the voters of the district about a referendum, that I don't care which way you vote as long as you vote from an informed perspective. And I think that was what we felt the benefit of this evening was to help inform people so they can understand more of the situation at hand. Thank you.
Mr. Feeney, any comments that you would like to make?
Just a few additional comments that this part of the state, I'm Jerry Feeney, by the way. I'm the executive director of the Wisconsin Rural Schools Alliance. And so I'm representing rural schools from throughout the state of Wisconsin. And what you're experiencing down in the southwestern part of the state is very true in the northeastern part of the state, is very true in the northwestern part of the state. It is a very serious situation that rural school districts have been disproportionately affected by the revenue limit over the last 20 years. The reason why is that because of size and declining enrollment, revenue limits have either been held flat or actually reduced. There are 49 school districts in the state that have less of a revenue limit now than they had 10 years ago. 44 of those are rural. Now you can imagine what the cost of just inflationary costs has meant that they've had to reduce programs and budgets. There's nothing more to cut. You have to, transportation costs go up, you have to pay insurance, you have to maintain your building. There is nothing more that can be cut. So opportunities for our rural children is being dramatically affected. And when Bambi talked about the fact we are to try to provide equal opportunity for our children no matter where they live, that's not happening. And when we're taking public funds now and trying to support a whole second education system, the private system, where is that going to leave our children in rural school districts? They will be further hurt. This whole idea of moving our state to a different, defunding public education to increase private education is going to be very harmful to Dodgeville, southwestern Wisconsin, northern Wisconsin, our rural children, no matter where they live.
Thank you, Jerry. At this point in time, I'm going to ask Senator Dale Schultz to come forward. I think he will have a few opinions that he would like to share as well. And actually, Dale, you volunteered to do a little dance routine for us.
No, I said I'd sing. I said I'd sing, but I generally do that when consuming libations that aren't legal in schools. I want to apologize right from the outset. I see a couple of you were at this morning's forum that was put on by the Chamber of Commerce, so I might repeat myself a little bit. But that's probably a good thing because you know I'm not changing what I'm saying to fit the audience. You know, the last 5 years or so have been pretty hard on all of us. You think about your family and your business, your job. You think about your neighbor's family, their business, their jobs. We've all had a rough go of it. We've called it the Great Recession. And it's been hard. And it doesn't really matter whether it's a small business or a public sector job, everybody is sacrificed. And that is not lost on me. What I do in Madison, sometimes people think takes great courage and they wonder if I'm holding up, and I tell them it's not a tough thing. What's tough is to go around and see my friends and neighbors who are struggling during these difficult times. And I don't really care whether they're a Republican or a Democrat or where they work, because at the end of the day, we're all neighbors and we all care about each other. You know, Wisconsin has a long and proud tradition of supporting public education. It is mentioned in our state constitution. This is the state, for heaven's sakes, where we invented kindergarten. Our citizenry has always cared about the next generation, and we have always, despite how tough things were, and it's been tough before. My dad was a product of the Depression. I've heard plenty. I've read plenty. People have always dug deep for their kids. State government, as was mentioned, has been a strong partner in that endeavor throughout our state's history. And I really think that we're at a watershed moment with respect to our public schools. Is that commitment going to continue, or isn't it? Well, let me just say that I agree with what Bambi Stats had to say about having an open mind. If there are ideas, we should discuss them. From time to time, we should try some ideas and see how they work. What wasn't mentioned here earlier is that the school choice experiment has at best mixed results. Most of the research shows that it doesn't even perform as well as our public schools. So it's not like this money should be taken off the top because it's good for kids. The facts show otherwise. I think we recognize in Milwaukee and have always recognized in Milwaukee that we had a little different situation just because of the socioeconomic burden that much of that city and school district carries. I think to some extent that's true in Racine, and there has been an outcry in both those communities by parents for an option like this. And I think that's why the legislature has supported it. But now we have a whole different thing that's occurring. We have this proposed expansion in places where there is no public outcry for this new middle class entitlement. I'd like to think of myself as a relatively conservative guy. Real conservatives, it seemed to me, shouldn't be going around inventing more middle class entitlements. Maybe government should do what it does well and not get into the education business of inventing more and more educational choices. We have a great tradition in this state of a partnership between our parochial schools and our public schools. So for those parents who care and care a lot about religious instruction and believe it ought to be a part of a young person's education, do have that opportunity. But as was pointed out, our Constitution forbids us mixing religion in our public schools. For those parents who are so passionate about education, they insist on being involved, we have opened the door and we have said we want you, and we have encouraged a partnership with those parents with our public schools. And it has worked pretty well, and very often they become the best supporters of our public institutions because they do care about education and they care about kids, and they are willing to walk the walk, not just talk it. So we have a lot of choices. We give parents the opportunity to open enroll to other school districts if they feel they're not being served. And that involves a degree of competition between school districts, sometimes more than I'd actually like. I think we maybe need a little more nurturing and a little less competition when it comes to education. Now we're beginning to talk about for-profit schools. All of these other options, we haven't been talking about profit. We've been talking about doing whatever we're going to do for the kids. We're going to do what's right for the kids, and we're not lining somebody's pocket. And we're going to, I think, have a very interesting debate about this. What disturbs me, though, in this great, proud tradition, that we have an opportunity here to have a great debate about a change of direction, and some people don't want to have it. They want to take policy like this, put it in a state budget, a bill that has to pass. For heaven's sakes, we don't want to look like Washington, D.C., right? And they want it to pass, and I think that should be something that people should take note of. Now, many of you met me at your door during the last election, and I listened carefully, just as I'm listening carefully throughout southwestern Wisconsin, gathering input on the budget. And what I was told was, Dale, please go to Madison, work together with everyone, and balance our state budget, help create some jobs, and focus on real solutions to real problems. I've tried to do that to the best of my ability. One of the things that I said I was very angry about and disturbed about in the last administration was the inclusion of so much controversial policy in the state budget. You remember the insurance mandates and the rest. Bob, I know you were there at several of those meetings. What's good for the goose is good for the gander. It's not okay to say Democratic policy is bad, but Republican policy is good. I know from time to time we've always had some policy in the budget that doesn't make it right. And for the most part, when it was there, it wasn't that controversial until the last couple budgets. People sort of got the idea, I'm elected, I'm going to do what I want, get over it. In these tough times, I think government can and should do more. It should remember that we're all in this together. And the things that we want that aren't partisan, like kids and their education, we ought to be able to sit down and have a civil discussion about. You have the right to see your legislature debate these issues. I want very much this and a whole lot of other policy to be brought out of the budget and to be debated openly in a fully transparent manner. Now look, my party has the governorship, the majority in the Senate, and the Assembly. What do we have to be afraid of? Your anger, your wrath? I can't come up with a reason other than that. And maybe some of my colleagues would rather say, I really didn't have a choice, Mr. and Mrs. Citizen, I had to vote for the budget. Well, they do have a choice. The choice is to take an affirmative vote and to pull policy out of the budget. Now, we had some success already. It was announced just the other day that 10 or 12 items were going to be pulled out of the budget, including one that I have received a lot of input on, the foreign ownership of farmland. Well, I got to hand it to the farm community. They got irritated, they got motivated, they made phone calls, they buttonholed legislators, and the message was received in Madison. Now, my question to each and every one of you tonight is, you've heard a presentation, pretty informative. I'll tell you right up front, I'm glad I didn't have to do that because it is complicated. I have done it before. But I'll tell you what, it is really in your hands. Now, I know today I got phone calls from friends of mine saying there are robocalls coming into my house telling me support this provision in the budget, and they're coming out of Milwaukee. I said, well, I understand. That's part of our political process. You're likely to see a lot of advertising on television and radio about the budget, and I think what you need to do is consider the message, if there is one, and say, all right, how does this inform me or not inform me, and why are they doing it? These for-profit entities, supported by a lot of billionaires who do not live in Southwest, do not even live in Wisconsin, are out selling snake oil. At this point, I got to tell you a little story. I told it this morning. I told it the other night in Sauk City when there were 10 school districts present. About 30 years ago, a skinny kid went to an annual meeting down in Sauk Prairie. He'd been invited by one of the most distinguished gentlemen in the community, a fellow by the name of Melvin Sprecher. Bob, I'll bet you remember Melvin because he was one of the founders of Wisconsin Dairies. Put that organization together. When that young man got to that gymnasium that night, there was 750 some odd people there, and they were agitated. It was an annual meeting. Not unlike a lot of annual meetings. A lot of tempers and squabbling. The one thing that's certainly true, everybody in the room cares about kids, and they just wanted to be heard. The whole point of that young man being there was to have to describe the state school aid formula. And the very first thing that was said when he approached the microphone from a guy in the back who yelled very loudly and very clearly, "What the hell are you doing here?" See, they didn't think they needed the state to resolve their local prerogatives and what their kids were going to learn and what it was going to cost. They could fight among themselves. At the end of the day, they were still a community, and they jealously guarded what was important. I was that kid. Still think I'm a kid some days. But I came away from that one experience with this in mind, and that you need to respect school boards and the men and women who selfishly put themselves out there and interject themselves into those squabbles because they care about all of their neighbors, regardless of their viewpoints. And that's the great tradition we have with public schools in this state. And you have recourse. It's not some corporation based in California or Oklahoma. It's right here. You paid for it, you own it, and you can change it. I want to just tell you that we have a lot of charter schools in this state sponsored by local school boards. Over here in Highland, they turned their whole school into an environmental charter. I've worked with environmental elementary schools in a number of different districts. There are a whole host of different ideas that have been put out there where local school boards sat down and listened to education advocates in their community and said, yeah, we'll try it. And the state has been there to support them. There isn't any evidence that I'm aware of that school boards have been negligent in providing this option to communities. Now, we have had some expansion, as you've heard, with non-school districts because there are a few people out there who said, for heaven's sakes, we got to get this away from school boards. They shouldn't have this monopoly. We haven't had a lot of them, but we've had some. Now, just imagine 30 years ago the reaction of that audience, and now sitting in the state budget, not proposed to be debated much, is the idea of taking away a huge chunk of authority and giving a state school board of political appointees, not elected, the authority to override local school boards. Is that what you want? Are you willing to stand up, call buttonhole legislators and to say, look, I don't care how you vote so much as I care that you think enough of us to stand up and say what you think and what you're going to do in an open manner, and you shouldn't be hiding behind the budget? Because if you don't, you won't be as successful as those farmers were. You're it. I'm here tonight telling you that my job is to represent you. I try to listen pretty often and to do it as well as I can. And that means that when I've made up my mind, I should be candid and open with you at how I feel. No razzle-dazzle. We're not going to dance around and confuse people. I think you deserve to know that. And you know what? This isn't about whether Dale keeps a job that has been a wonderful honor for 30 years. It's about something far greater than me. It's about our families and our children. And I think it's pretty important that we stand up and say what we say needs to be said. And I want you to know I'm going to fight as hard as I can to support our public schools in a constructive way, not in a destructive way. Wanted to touch briefly on this school report card issue. You know, I think most of us want to do better and are expected to do better as time goes by. That certainly is the philosophy in my household, and it doesn't just apply to my children. I hold myself to that same standard. I think many people know that for years after each legislative session I've gone around and held myself accountable and issued a report card and gave it to local media and talked about the good, the bad, and what went on in the legislative session. Schools are no different. I believe schools do need to be held accountable. I believe everybody needs to be held accountable. Not too long ago, we went down that road with hospitals. A lot of sweaty palms. What if somebody finds out that everything isn't perfect here? They find out that this isn't just science and mechanics, it's an art. And sometimes we just can't fix everything. And what if maybe our population we're serving is poorer, older, sicker, more prone to accident than the neighboring community? Is anybody going to notice that in the report card? Well, a lot of us said, you know what, we need to do something about health care costs. We need to do something about health care outcomes. We need to be concerned about quality. And we encourage them to come together and begin to talk about standards of practice and to talk about changing decision making and making it a little more data driven so we could squeeze more dollars out of health care. People went along with that and they were responsible, and it's worked pretty well. Superintendent Tony Evers sat down with Governor Walker amongst some other parties and said, let's be Wisconsinites first and let's discuss accountability. That was what Bambi was talking about, that they would sit down and figure out how we could do a better job with our schools. A lot of sweaty hands around. That information could be misused in a hurry. Well, before the ink was hardly dry, we had to have report cards and have all this talk about failing schools. If a whole influx of immigrants comes into a small school district and suddenly you have some real significant needs, or maybe because a group home opened in a little tiny school district like my home school district, or what was my home school district up at Weston, suddenly they had a whole pile of kids that they couldn't handle in Racine, and they've got them in a group home up there, and that little school district is supposed to meet their needs. They can't do quite the job they could with some of the other kids before, and right away we got a failing school. Is that their fault? I don't think so. After all, it's a partnership. Now, I think it is fair that we look at the data, but we ought to look at it fairly and thoughtfully. I'm very disturbed about this talk of failing schools everywhere. People have gotten pretty loose-lipped about it. I think our schools, at least in the eyes of the constituents I talk to in my district, are pretty special places. And while people do have their concerns, for the most part, they think they have a good school district. They'd want it to be better. They'd like to be able to get more money. They'd like more state money, a little more state support. But I think one thing that we all ought to be able to agree on is we're likely to be a lot more successful by supporting what is good rather than tearing down what we don't see as quite so good. Leadership to me is constructive. It's not destructive. Now I've started to ramble a little bit, but those are a few of my thoughts about tonight's presentation about the upcoming state budget. I want you to know that my door is always open to each and every one of you. I have other concerns in the state budget. This morning I talked about them. I won't talk about them so much here, but I do want one to say one thing. I had the dubious distinction at the end of the last legislative session to be the one guy in this state everybody wanted to recall. I voted for that budget, and everybody who suddenly thought I was a great guy voting against Act 10 said, no, he's really a bum. Well, I believed we needed balanced budgets. I think most of my constituents believe that. And we all went through a lot of pain to get there. I know our school districts went through a lot of pain to get there. The last thing we need to do is to make all of your sacrifices meaningless because we don't have the gumption to do what needs to be done. And I'll be happy to answer questions about what we can do in those regards and give you an opportunity to ask me questions. And if you just want to stand up and vent, that's okay too. If it makes you feel better, I think that's great. I'm sure I'll learn something. And I also want to let you know I'll be happy to hang around afterwards for a little while and chat with anybody who has any concerns about this or anything else. Thank you.
Would you mind staying up here and I'll ask Bambi?
Sure.
Okay, at this point, we're going to open the floor to questions. So, Dr. Stotz, if you would come forward as well. And I'm going to ask you to repeat the question for our recording back there so that they can hear your answers. So at this point, are there questions from the floor?
It is a projected cost based upon a projection of the number of students who might be interested. So it's an estimate. Oh, I'm sorry, you did tell me that. Okay, the question was, in showing the second year of the biennium for the special needs vouchers, where does that cost of $13,500 or $13,900, $13,900, where does that come from? Fiscal Bureau is an independent analytical body that serves the legislature and the public, and they do this by looking at what the components of a proposal, in this case a budget, is, and they're looking at each of those components and they're estimating what the true impact is. And so in doing that, they had to make projections on how many people might opt for that choice. And there are also, I don't remember exactly if there's a cap in that, in the language, but sometimes with a new program there's a cap in it. I'm sorry I can't tell you that offhand, but between what the actual language of the bill is and then what the projection of how many people might be wanting to take advantage of that in the first year versus the second year, that's where the number came from. It's a projection. It's a projected cost. Maybe you have, well, again, they're projecting that because it really has to do with the property values, the state aid in the community in which the child resides. There's a little formula that combines those two factors and identifies the money that transfers with that child. So it could be different per district. So they're looking at a statewide average kind of situation.
Sometimes I can be a numbers person too, but I think what I've found in my job over the years that's even more important is when you can kind of relate this to people in a way that sort of resembles the way people talk around the grill in their backyard or at the kitchen table. Just what does this mean? And I think a lot of people are in this room are probably wondering, well, how do the parents and special needs students feel about all this? I mean, we're ostensibly doing this for their benefit, right? Well, let me tell you, like I said, I get out night after night. I listen to people. People come in and see me. Many of you are recipients of my email newsletter. It's the largest in the Capitol by far. We have the largest Facebook following of anybody in the Capitol. We really try to reach out. What I have heard almost universally from special needs parents is, don't do this. Don't do this to us, our children, or our community. And here's why, Dale. Because what was pointed out here earlier is that not every special needs child costs the same. They don't. Some are far more expensive, and their problems are far more profound than others. And it's no small mystery in a for-profit world where people can pick and choose the elements that they're dealing with in a manufacturing setting, forgive me. But in a public school, we can't do that. We have to take everybody. As imperfect as every one of us is, we all go to the same place. But in this competitive model, this for-profit model, guess what they're going to go after? Guess who they're going to recruit? And all the school districts are going to be left with less money, more obligation. You didn't really go through the federal maintenance of effort requirement, which you maybe want to touch on, and even more exacerbated funding problems within our public schools. Well, do you really want those kids, those vulnerable kids coming from those stressed out families pitted against the rest of the student population? I sure don't. I'd like to think that all of us can share and need to share, but I'll tell you what, you're going to see the stress level go right through the roof, and they know that. And they don't want that because they, and I say the parents particularly, they believe just as you and I do. We want every child to be the best that they can possibly be. And we all know, quite frankly, there isn't enough money for our kids because they're our kids. And there are limits imposed by the state. And that means we have to work together and do the best we can for everyone. Whether you're the most gifted and your child is the most gifted and talented, or the most severe and profoundly disabled young person. It's not something I favor doing. It's not something I find any support among my constituents. If you feel differently, you're certainly welcome to say it tonight or contact me later. I've got my ears open, and so far all I'm receiving or hearing about is robocalls coming out of Milwaukee that are costing somebody a lot of money. My staff told me today that they asked somebody, where you calling from, and the guy said home. You know, look, I appreciate people providing input, but I always try to sort of grade the quality of that input. And when somebody has been awoken from their mid-afternoon nap and told to immediately call their senator, oh, and we'll connect you, and here's what you should tell them, I'm not certain that's as high a quality of interchange as we're seeing here tonight. You want to?
Well, just very briefly, the maintenance of effort is, in order for school districts to be eligible, continue to be eligible for the federal dollars that flow with children with disabilities, each school district has to demonstrate that they have put in a certain amount of effort, dollar-wise, towards serving the overall population. And that isn't going to go down, even though some of their population might choose to go somewhere else. So that will be just a further penalty for the school districts that lose students. You did touch on that. The question is, who would be the state authorizing board for the independent charters? And you did encapsulate that. Do you want to?
Sure. Well, I can't remember the exact membership, but it's a statewide board that is composed of folks that are appointed by legislative leaders and the governor. And that's a very different situation than a community voting to elect these people. We're not talking about a statewide election where people get elected based on their views. We're talking about political appointees. Yeah.
I might just embellish on that, not to define this authorizing board, but to say that when we look at the other states across the country, another way in which Wisconsin is so unique and has demonstrated its commitment to public education has been the fact that we have a constitutional office in Wisconsin called State Superintendent. That's highly different. Most states have a state board of education, which is elected and is a highly political body. Our state superintendency is not of a political party. It is an independent constitutional office. So having a separate entity like this, appointed and non-elected, not only kind of skirts the fact that Wisconsin has always chosen not to have a state board of education, but it does that in a way that the public has no input. So, other questions? Okay, very good. Very good question. The question is, if a family starts out the school year and they have chosen to go to a choice or a voucher school, but they get there somewhat into the school year and they determine that that's not the best option for their child, so they return to the public schools. Well, as Senator Schultz said, as public schools, we have the obligation, we have the desire to serve every child that comes through our door. So it doesn't matter whether that child is there on day 1 or comes on day 31 or day 62 or whatever. We have an obligation and, again, a desire to serve. However, we have, I don't want to get too detailed, but we have a count date, the 3rd Friday in September, which determines the portion of state support that we're going to get and the level of our revenue raising ability before we set our levies. So that count date in September is really important. When children come to our community after that count date, we still serve them every year. But we don't get any incentive. We don't get an ability to get more state support or more local property tax support. So in essence, that child would come to our community. We would serve that child, as we should, at the expense of every other child, if I can put it that way crudely, because we would continue to serve everybody's needs the best that we can. Well, we have 2 count dates. The second one is in January, and they're averaged. And there is some reconciliation of the choice schools as well. So it's not quite the same as ours occurs, but there is some reconciliation. But it wouldn't be down to the day when we serve the child versus they do.
Well, you've said a lot there, and let me just respond in a couple different ways, because I'm not sure everything was a question, but it yet certainly deserves a response. But let me answer your first, or your last real question first, by just saying I don't have any particular insight on the relationship between various legislators. All I can do is look at myself in the mirror in the morning and remind myself of my responsibilities. I'm here as a public servant. I'm certainly not complaining about my salary. It's all self-inflicted. I'm the one that ran for the job. And it just proves to me every day when I look in the mirror that my life isn't just about the money. It's about a wonderful responsibility and a privilege that people have given me, some 165,000 in total. They gave me the most precious thing they can give me in a democracy, the right to cast a vote for them. We know in this country that Citizens United upended all campaign finance laws. Montana for 100 years said no corporate money, and that was thrown out. The first bill I brought to the floor of the state Senate was a campaign finance reform bill, and it was defeated, but I'm proud to say that the majority of my caucus voted for it. But I want to be clear. No political party's hands are clean in this, and I think each and every one of us knows that intuitively. But I think it's important that we challenge ourselves from time to time and remember that what we're doing here isn't just a grab for power. It isn't just a grab for self-glory. It's about important questions that face the community. I've always said I would take people over money any day of the week. And I've existed in a place where Republicans shouldn't have existed for 30 years. My good friend Tom Loftus remarked that 30 years ago, and I've survived. I've survived because people have crossed over to vote for me, people who are unaligned have voted for me, and yeah, I probably got the majority of Republican votes as well. But it'll be a sad day when I doubt people, but I don't doubt people. And the fact that you're here tonight, when many of you could have been home raking your lawn and enjoying a beautiful summer evening, inspires me. I really appreciate and congratulate you on your citizenship. But I am troubled by it. The amounts of money that are being spent now are astronomical. And I wonder about the chump who writes a check for $100 and thinks he's somehow or another going to influence a politician when there are hundreds of thousands of dollars at stake. And I worry about the future of our democracy. But you know what? A wise person said many years ago, the price of liberty is eternal vigilance, and I remember that too. Kind of glory. I've been around for some budgets like that, and that's really disappointing. I think the real question is, will legislators stand up and say, no, we're willing to debate this. We don't have to hide behind the budget. We're not going to insist on hijacking the budget. And I think that's really the question. And that really, again, comes down to you. I will tell you that I will work with anyone to pass a budget. I have voted for budgets that I've voted for far more budgets than I voted against. I voted for Republican budgets and Democrat budgets. when I felt I was listened to, and they were reasonable for the people that I represent and met the needs at least as communicated to me. But I think it'll be a sad day for a state with a proud history of public education if people will insist on hiding this in a state budget. Because if it's hidden in a state budget, I don't want to predict exactly what will happen, but I'm going to do everything in my power to make sure that it comes out, because I think that's the right thing to do.
This is a board member from Highland, and she's talking about accountability and how accountability exists for public officials, and as a local school board member, she feels that accountability for spending, for programs, for student performance. If I can, tell me if I don't encapsulate this. But I think a concern is that the same level of accountability might not exist with some voucher schools that are receiving public funds. And how do we know that the dollars that are going to these schools are really addressing student needs and an improved situation? Is that something? How do you replace perception with reality? Okay.
I'll take that. Well, let me make it easy for you. Everybody in the room, pay attention. This is complicated. Now, what's the question you want to ask me about what concerns you with respect to vouchers? What's the first question you want to ask me after hearing everything tonight? Well, even before that. 'Cause nope. Come on now, folks. The first question you got to ask me is, are you going to vote to take this out of the state budget, or are you going to hide behind the fact that this budget has to pass? That's a straight up yes or no. Would you vote for an amendment? Will you prevent even the need for an amendment by standing up and saying it's wrong, don't do it? Does anybody in here think we ought to put stuff in the budget and never debate anything? I didn't think there would be anybody. That's the first question you ask. And then when you got that question out of the way, then you say, look, this is a complicated subject. Tell me your thinking on it. What have you learned? How do you feel about it? Let me tell you what I think, and then tell me what you're going to do. Not as complicated as I kind of led on. And that's where your question, which is a very good question, then comes in saying, talk to me about accountability. Let me tell you what accountability I live with, and let's reason together. Not every question is black and white. You know, when it comes to accountability, there's a lot of opportunities. It reminds me of Obi-Wan Kenobi in one of those Star Wars movies saying, only Siths deal in absolutes. I guess not a lot of Star Wars fans here. I liked it. At any rate, look, that's the process of citizenship. There's nothing magical about that. We've been doing that for years. And I want to just give you a little tip. Talk to your neighbors. Look, I'll tell you, I'm willing to come anywhere and answer any question. I will tell you, I can't be all things to all people. I picked on Bob a lot tonight, and he'll be the first one to tell you we haven't always agreed on everything. But he always got a straight answer, didn't he, Bob? And I think that's the essence of democracy. We choose people based on straight answers to simple questions. We break up the complex stuff into simple questions. And you know what you should assume if you don't hear yes? Then you better assume no. If you get all done with the razzle-dazzle and the distractions, the papers, the charts, and all that stuff, and you're going, no, was that a yes or a no? If you can't clearly in your mind say, yeah, it was a yes, then you better assume no. And then you can hold people accountable just like people hold you accountable. That's what I do. Let me just say that if you want to invite me to talk about the budget anywhere, call my office. This is what I'm doing. I'm not running for higher office. I'm here doing the job that you hired me to do, which is to work on a state budget a good deal of which is listening to people night after night, day after day. And I'll try to take it all in and make the best decisions I can, and afterwards you'll have the opportunity to hold me accountable. Wanted to put a plug in for something else that I think is very important. How many of you here are familiar with Wisconsin Eye? Well, good, we got a few people. Let me explain to you what Wisconsin Eye is. If you have broadband, and I know everybody in my district does not have broadband, but we're working on it, believe me. But if you don't have broadband, you can go to the library and avail yourself of this information, and many cable services have it. Wisconsin Eye is the Wisconsin version of C-SPAN. Everybody knows what C-SPAN is, right? Okay, there's a big difference though. Wisconsin Eye is run by a nonpartisan, bipartisan board. It's not a government entity, and they control the cameras. In Washington, D.C., the politicians control the camera. That's why sometimes you realize you're listening to somebody's speech on the floor, and then somehow or another they slip and you see there's nobody else in the chamber. Well, Wisconsin Eye goes to virtually all government meetings and tapes them. Not everyone, but virtually all. And you can watch them in real time. You don't even have to go to Madison. And you know what? You can also get them out of an archive years later and see what somebody said and then what they did. Sometimes people change their mind, I understand that, but then you can say, why did you do that? And that's part of that accountability process as well. So as this issue moves on, along with all the other issues in the state budget, I urge you to pay attention. I warn you though, it can be habit forming, and I have one other request, and that is if you like what you see, send them a note and a couple dollars because it's privately funded.
Went to public schools when they were growing up. I'm sure he went to private schools, but I'm sure the vast majority went to public schools. And I'm sure that the vast majority of them send their children to public schools. And I can understand why they would want to smash the teachers union because they didn't like the money going against them in campaigns. But I don't understand why they would just cut the throat of something that has been so vital to their own life, education in public schools, and to their children and their grandchildren. It just doesn't make any sense to me that all these possibilities that exist within the state budget that we've been talking about regarding education are even possibilities when you consider that education is such a lifeblood, and that these representatives and senators represent districts where education is the lifeblood of every community, big and small. And I just do not understand the mindset, and that's why I'm asking you, of your fellow Republicans, how they can be so foolish to just buy into the notion that we should have statewide vouchers, which is the end game that we all understand is going on here.
I'm not comfortable speaking for what people do and their motivations because I don't know. I think the questions you ask are perfectly valid and they are important. All I can do is control what I do. And in this troubled time when politics seems to be so crazy, when a lot of people wonder the same things that you wonder, I guess I've come to the conclusion, along with my friend Senator Cullen, the best thing we can do is try to set a good example. I'm not perfect, neither is he. And the things that you ask and you wonder about are certainly very important questions. And people ought to be asked that question more regularly. Where do you draw the line between what you're willing to do politically, because it is sort of a team activity, and then when are you willing to draw the line and say no? I've publicly said many times, I think these days the most important question in the Capitol is which team are you on? Sort of like which gang are you on? I tell people proudly I represent all the people when I'm asked that question. Then I ask them, what the hell team are you on? You know, I'm going to be tomorrow in Prairie du Chien, in a correctional institution, listening to a bunch of guards. In my last election, my opponent represented the union for those people. It's not an excuse to go and not listen to those people. Where I come from, you compete. Political parties should state their positions on all the issues. And they should compete for the hearts and minds of their fellow citizens. It's not okay to say, I won, you're out, get over it. And that sometimes makes me angry too after some 45 years involved in politics and nearing 32 years in the state legislature. We can and we must do better than what we're doing now. And as I told my colleagues when I assumed the majority leadership a few sessions back, we have the reputation we earn. And I don't think these days, if you measure up public opinion with legislative bodies against schools, it's a contest.
Thank you. One of the things that we haven't talked about tonight is how do we solve the problems in the Milwaukee area? Because last night, me and my wife were at a meeting in Madison, and Mark O'Connell from the Wisconsin Counties Association spoke. And he made a comment that if the Milwaukee area fails, so will the state of Wisconsin. I mean, there's a huge population base in that area. You know, there's a lot of elected officials that come from that area, but if we're not spending money on education in that area, we're going to be spending money on the social programs in that area. And we could eliminate vouchers entirely in that area. So how do we solve the educational problem in that area so that improves the economy? You know, we're spending hundreds of millions of dollars in transportation in that area because it funnels all the traffic through there into the state of Wisconsin. We're concerned about the economy in that area because it's a huge economy. If that fails, it'll affect the state of Wisconsin. And obviously the education system failing is affecting us at the local level. What have you done as a senator over the years to try to solve the problem? And Bammy, what is your opinion on how to solve the problem in that area to help us out in the rural communities?
I wish we'd started that earlier. That way, for certain people watching this will hear it. When I became majority leader, I made a point of getting around the state. And that meant I was gone from my home district more than I liked. But fortunately, when I explained to people that I had a new and larger responsibility, they, for the most part, were pretty supportive of me. Because I believe, too, that we are all in this great state together. And some parts of the state have the capacity, if they fail, to drag us all down. Anybody here been to Detroit lately? Anybody? Let me tell you, you should do it. You should do it. I had my first chance to see Detroit a couple years ago. Once the fourth largest city in this country, the home of our automobile industry, and a community that was steeped in culture, great work ethic. And now it's mile after mile of vacant blocks, deteriorating infrastructure, and bulldozed buildings. Recently, a mayor got himself in trouble because he was unable to accomplish the single task that was most important in his campaign, bulldozing 10,000 buildings. Milwaukee is a great community, and it's still a great community. The last time I was in Milwaukee here this past month, I was on Mike Boucher's television show and with Tim Cullen, and I stopped by to see the mayor, who I served with many years ago, because he was concerned about another piece of policy in the state budget, getting rid of the ability of local units of government to demand residency within their districts. A lot of mayors out here are very, very concerned about response times for police and fire, and they want to make certain that they don't lose control of that. It's an important issue. These days, families are split up, they go in different directions, and it's hard to make a living. But is that really an issue that belongs in a state budget? I don't think so. I'd like to get it out, and he wanted to talk to me, and I made some time available because he has a big job in a very difficult part of the state. I've been to choice schools, public schools in Milwaukee. I think that we need to, first of all, recognize that schools aren't the only determinant of whether or not a kid's going to learn. bet Diane can tell you that kids that show up hungry don't learn very well. I'm shocked some of the community schools I've been to recently where there's a number of parents there at noon. And at first I thought, my gosh, this is just terrific, until I realized they were there because it was the cheapest meal in town. And I was ashamed. Goes on right in southwestern Wisconsin, don't kid yourself. And a lot of kids come to school hungry. We've had skyrocketing rates of free and reduced lunch because of the effect of the recession. Juvenile delinquency and crime is a huge problem. There's a greater chance of a young black man in the Milwaukee public school system, this was true a few years ago, I suspect it's probably still true, going to prison out here than graduating from high school. I'm here to tell you, it's not all the school's fault. If you're living at home and father isn't present, you don't even know who your father is, mother is a drug addict, and your brothers and sisters are either in jail or pretty badly messed up, what chance do you have? Is that the school's fault? I don't think so. I'm not absolving the school entirely. I think, again, people have a right to be held accountable. I grew up learning that we are our brother's keepers. Maybe we ought to just think about that over there. We're having a hard time generating jobs. One of the things we're trying to do, I'm certainly supportive, is helping them get their transportation sector in place. I got support from Milwaukee years ago with my colleagues to get 151 finished out here. It's the same road, folks. It's time we recognize that. The great wealth of our state comes from southeastern Wisconsin. We can't ignore what goes on in Milwaukee. And I've tried over the years to be supportive of their technical college, their university, and businesses over there. And I'll continue to do that. And I think that's one of the reasons I've been successful at getting people to pay attention to us once in a while on the things that matter to us. And again, schools are an important part of the equation. But let's stop with walking around with this loose talk about failing schools, because it's destructive, it's not constructive. I think we need constructive solutions. Yes, sir.
Well, you're both concerned with accountability, as you should be. I like to raise accountability on a different level, and that's accountability for the content of the education being delivered in the charter schools. What is happening, as you point out, we're losing control at the state level. And what's happening is, as more of our public money is going into charter schools, faith-based educations, we are watering down and literally destroying the science education in our schools today. I'm a scientist. I and many scientists are vitally concerned that we are raising children who think that the earth is 6,000 years old. You can't do that and live in this society, in this culture. We have to get some measure of control, and as we put more funding into faith-based education, we are losing the education of science, and that is a disservice to everyone who graduates and ultimately to our country. You want to see Detroit everywhere? Raise a bunch of dummies.
That's pretty well said. Not all the problems are in the faith-based schools. There's plenty of these institutes of excellence, as I said, which are little more than frauds, plain frauds. Well, we live in a world now where there are no facts, and everything we know is on the internet, and it's all true. It's just a reality. But I agree with you. I think we do need to fight for the notion of a fair and free debate, the notion that there are facts, and that we need to pay attention to them when we discuss issues. You know, again, I think the way that we do that is we engage one another in forums like this. We don't allow people to hide behind a vote on a budget. Yes, sir, you haven't had a chance. Here, let me give you the microphone.
I had a question on the funding of the vouchers. Our district is about 91,000 this year. I was on the assumption, just maybe that way I was thinking, that it was actually funded through like valuation. But so to clarify this, it's actually 1.4% reduction in general aid. That's how we're assessed. Our district is, or all the districts. Is that correct? Correct. Yeah. Okay. So it's a 1.4% reduction in the general aid. Okay.
Don't feel compelled to answer this question, Dale. I said don't feel compelled to answer this tonight, but I do hope for all our sake you'll consider running as an independent.
I think I've told people pretty clearly that I view my job right now as working on a state budget, not considering my political future. I mean that, so I'm going to duck the question. I won't feel compelled. Traditionally, I've made up my mind on what I'm going to do at the end of the year after careful consultation with family and close friends, and I'll do that, and I'll do it in a responsible way. I'm not going to be bullied, baited, or anything else into doing this or that by somebody pandering to a fear that I might not be reelected. That doesn't concern me. What concerns me is doing a good job for each and every one of you, and I appreciate the comments about accountability. Those are entirely appropriate.
The question is, after 20 years, about 22 or 23 years of the Milwaukee Parental Choice Program, do we have data, information on graduation rates? I assume you mean there compared to the public schools, and performance. I don't off the top of my head have information on graduation rates. I do know, and I was Assistant State Superintendent when the program was instituted in 1990 and had the responsibility for administering the program, enlisting the choice schools, evaluating the program, and we hired an external third-party evaluator on purpose to look at test scores and make comparisons. And even in the early 90s, there was no evidence to suggest that the students in the choice schools performed any better than did the children in the public schools. And Senator Schultz has said that there's recent, and I've seen it as well, recent evidence to suggest the same thing. In other words, that we cannot say that the children in the choice schools are performing better than, and in fact, what I've seen is sometimes less well than the children in the public schools. Okay, the question is, thinking historically, in school districts, if a private school had a student with special needs but didn't or couldn't meet those needs, wasn't the public school responsible? Yes. And again, on 40 years of administration of public education in this state, and the first chunk of my career started out as special ed administrator, and that I have found to be true over and over and over. And I have seen situations go to the federal government for clarification, which always came back to the local public school district and said, if nobody else does it, you have responsibility. And in fact, if somebody else is doing it, you may have to do, again, which we think we should have to do, but do the evaluation of the child's needs and prescribe the range of services that that child needs, and do the re-evaluations and the reports on that student. It is my experience that the local public school bears that responsibility under federal law. Let me clarify. I don't know exactly what if it's a private school, not a public school, that would choose to participate in the special needs vouchers, what they're agreeing that they will do. I'm going to plead ignorance on that. I'm not absolutely positive. But I have read in the language of that bill that the parents, if they choose a private option, would be signing off on their child's rights under the federal law. So that's a provision in the budget bill. Let me say for the umpteenth time, I'm not an attorney, but the federal law is aimed at the child's rights. And I'm not certain that the parent can sign off. I think the rights of that child with special needs have to be met under federal law. And again, my experience over decades has been that the public school is the responsible entity. That's as much as I can say. I don't know some of those details. There's some confusion, on my part at least, on how this would play out in spite of the language that's in the bill.
Thank you very much to both Senator Schultz and Dr. Stotz. We had some excellent questions here tonight. Great presentations and comments from both of you. I would like to make two final comments. I thanked or acknowledged the support of the Chamber of Commerce in providing us a forum this morning and helping us advertise the two events today. But in that acknowledgement, I failed to acknowledge also the key players of the Dodgeville and Southwest Wisconsin Education Association that were parties as well and helped do some of the graphics and the brochure that went out to folks. So it really was beneficial having those three entities help get word out to people, because we have reached over 85 people today in sharing this information. Additionally, could I have this paper? I've been asked to announce that at the high school, the Platteville High School auditorium on May 2nd at 6:30, there was going to be a 45-minute presentation on the Affordable Care Act. This is another issue that's of prime importance to citizens and employers and the public. So if you are interested in knowing more about that, May 2nd at the Platteville High School. And Senator Schultz is going to be, this is the same one. You are going to be present at that event. Yep. Fantastic. So if you are interested in that information, also the Chamber here in Dodgeville is going to be sponsoring a session on the Affordable Care Act as well. So again, thank you all for coming tonight. Thank you to our guests. I appreciate very, very much your participation.